All right, our guest today is Dr. Mark Bauerlein, who teaches English at Emory University. And we're talking with him specifically today because one question I've had as an educator is on the origin and development of the Common Core state standards. And it turns out that Mark Bauerlein was one of the scholars that was consulted during the development of the state standards. So we want to talk to him today about his experiences with that. Dr. Bauerlein teaches English at Emory University, where he's taught since 1989, with a 2.5-year break in 2003 to 2005 to serve as the Director, Office of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for Arts. Apart from his scholarly work, he publishes in several popular periodicals like the Wall Street Journal, the Weekly Standard, and the Washington Post. In 2008, he published a book entitled The Dumbest Generation: How the Digital Age Stupefies Young Americans and Jeopardizes Our Future, or Don't Trust Anyone Under 30. And he recently co-edited a collection of essays entitled The State of the American Mind, 16 Leading Critics on the New Anti-Intellectualism, which was published in 2015. So Dr. Bauerlein, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, thank you.
So I understand we met at a conference a while back, and while talking, it came to light that you were one of the scholars consulted on the development of the Common Core state standards. So I guess I should first, just before I ask a question about that, let me preface the Common Core state standards, for those who don't know, are a set of educational standards for K-12 education in the United States that was created in 2009, or it was started in 2009 as an initiative. And it's a set of state standards covering English and mathematics education that gives participating states a kind of guideline of these are the things that during second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, and on that you should be teaching at every grade level, with the idea that every participating state will now be on the same page regarding what is taught. So I guess with that preface in mind, can you just kind of briefly summarize kind of your participation in the Common Core state standards? Who asked you? How did you participate? What was your role, et cetera?
I think I was pulled in by the architects of Common Core. Sue Pimentel in particular was the one that I dealt with a lot. We had some conference calls, and then she had a lot of individual communication with us as they're developing the document, asking, what do you think of this? Can you develop something along the lines of this for us? And that they were, David Coleman and Sue Pimentel were kind of taking feedback from a lot of different sources. And what was important to them, I'm assuming this, is that they wanted different profiles to weigh in. And my profile was as a higher education English teacher. I teach a lot of freshman courses, which means I'm getting kids 3 months out of high school. I'm someone who could weigh in on some of the issues of college readiness at the select institutions. Emory is Emory University, where I am, is a pretty select institution. And so I would give that perspective on that transition to college. And you know how important college readiness was to the standards. The idea there was we don't just want to get students admitted to college. We want them to get into college where they are going to stay. We will keep them there so that 1 year in, they just haven't been able to cut it. So a lot of the high school curriculum in particular was about how do we get students prepared for that first year? Well, I was a first year teacher. Added to that, when I was at the National Endowment for the Arts, we did a big study called Reading at Risk. And it was about the decline of reading, particularly among younger Americans. And I tied this deterioration of reading habits, book habits, especially with literature, I tied this to broader cultural ignorance and the damage that this does to the intellectual lives of young Americans. And that fed into a lot of the Common Core concerns about crisis of education. We've been in crisis modes for several decades now. And particularly when we looked at things such as what has happened to reading scores on the NAEP exams. Reading scores are flat since the early 70s. Oh gosh, I mean, now we're at the point where reading scores on the SAT, they're at their lowest point in 40 years. And a tremendous amount of money and resources and theories and practices have gone into trying to improve things, and we're just stalled. Even when we've seen gains at 4th grade, when those students get older, there's a little gain at 8th grade. By 12th grade, they're flat. So something particular is happening in the high school years. My theory on this with the Dumbest Generation book was high school was when all the social media kicked in. And we found kids just having a bigger menu of nighttime diversions in their bedroom. And more, TV time was constant, but now we had more video games, we had more social media, email, texting, the whole thing. And that a lot of the book time and actually conversation with adults time was drifting downward, and that this was supported by the population data, and that this was going to hurt their reading comprehension skills, and that the reading comprehension skills would particularly suffer when they hit that first year of college and you get the complex texts being assigned to them. You've got to read a Supreme Court decision in a freshman composition class, and this is just too much. So that was my profile. That's what I could contribute. I'm not a primary and secondary education expert. I have spent a lot of time writing about the humanities in higher education, writing about cultural literacy generally among young people. So that was my contribution. And what I did was really push the idea that we need a rich literary curriculum that leaves students with a strong literary historical base when they go to college. I was operating against the idea of relevance. I don't think that the English course is best served by bringing in a lot of media materials, against the move toward 21st century skills, developing skills of collaboration and creativity and innovation. I was pushing for 19th century skills. Linear reading comprehension, slow, careful writing. That's why in my first year English classes, actually in my upper division English classes too, sometimes I have students write their papers by hand, and they have to turn them in written by hand. And I think there are sound reasons for that. But I would probably, in terms of pedagogical approaches, I was the traditionalist, the conservative among the group. And they didn't want a lot of people like me. They wanted 1 or 2 people like me, and then we want more people who talk about more contemporary, more multicultural, more cultural relevant materials for different student populations. And that what Sue and David did was try to bring the best of those things together. Now I'll give you my summary of how that went. I think the appendices to Common Core are excellent. They did talk about making sure that in the high school syllabus we have strong readings, that the vocabulary is high, that the historical import of a lot of these materials is high, because that is what's going to let them hit the ground running in college. So if you get a student who has read in high school English a lot of contemporary literature versus a student who has read a lot of older literature, let's just say the King James Bible. That student who has read the King James Bible is going to be clearly advantaged over students who've read contemporary literature primarily in U.S. history courses, in American literature courses, in American culture courses, because the King James Bible is everywhere in American life through the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So this is my argument, and in the appendices, I like the appendices because it reflected what I think there. The standards that they came up with are these highly abstract bullet points that I was a little disappointed in, because we lost a lot of that literary, historical, cultural richness that is in the appendices. The standards pared them down to, demonstrate facility with the conventions of standard English. No. And they had to do that. If they hadn't have done that, many people would have not gotten on board Common Core.
So I guess to go back to kind of the nuts and bolts of your participation, so you were contacted in what, 2009, 2010, or
around there? It went on for a couple of years.
Okay, and then. So what would happen? Would they send you, I guess, ask you questions, get your responses, then maybe send you drafts along the way of here's some standards, and then get your thoughts on them? Is that or
right? Little pieces of different things. I work mostly on the high school reading and the literary strand in the reading. They might want a little box, a sidebar to write a statement in the sidebar about the importance of something. They might ask me about the language of a particular standard. I remember one standard that I thought was pretty good, but which is almost impossible to assess. This standard is for 11th grade literary reading. Demonstrate knowledge, let me get this exactly right. I hope I get this exactly right. Demonstrate knowledge of 18th, 19th, and early 20th century foundational works of American literature. I thought that was great, but how do you test for that? I mean, that's a full year of coursework. Right. How do you test for that? Well, first of all, you have to give teachers some rough idea of what all those works are. Then what do? Multiple choice questions on that? No, you have to have essay questions on that, or at least short answer questions. And what kind of knowledge do you want? How broad do you want the knowledge? Do you want to test them on just pick a few works and have them go in depth on that? That was, I don't see how they're going to assess that. And from what I've seen, they're just ignoring that standard.
In the educational space, in higher ed, I'm in a college of education. That's one of the concerns, is that I know there's 2 testing consortia that are working on tests right now. And some of the concern is some of the standards may end up being very good, but like you said, it's how you test them in some ways almost determines the impact.
It is, and we realize now that you really know what an education reform is about when you see the tests, and then you see the scores on the tests, and then how people react to the scores. I was in one meeting of standards people, and when it came down to a recommended reading list, there were 20 people in the room. Everyone got extremely nervous. And I and one other person said, of course we're going to give a recommended reading list. Everyone else shot this down. One fellow said, look, you're trying to put Shakespeare on this list, and there's no reason for us to put Shakespeare on this list besides anyone else. I said, wow, okay.
It sort of brings us to some of the content of your 2008 book, The Dumbest Generation. Yeah. Because when I read it, I mean, of course, despite the provocative title, it's not that you're saying that these kids are incapable of skills. It seems like what you're saying is that the skills they're getting are not necessarily the skills that are going to be conducive to good thinking.
Right. There are 2 threads here. One is that the practices of the digital age for teenagers do not develop forms of advanced literacy and the kinds of cultural literacy, the knowledge backgrounds that are going to serve them well when they go to college and when they go out into the workplace.
How well do you think the standards that resulted will help with those concerns? Will introduce students to more, I guess, slower ways of thinking, more depth and things like that?
I think it will definitely help the students that are below the 70th percentile in terms of achievement. I think it won't affect much, maybe the 70th to the 80th percentile, one way or the other. It'll depend on the teacher. I think it will hurt the top 20% of students. The standards are better, the Common Core standards are better than many, many state standards. They were worse than some state standards. You know, Massachusetts had pretty strong English standards. It's a step down from those. It's a step up from Mississippi standards. So how you want to weigh that? I think it will depend. And of course, a lot of it will depend on the teacher. A great teacher can make great things out of those standards. That's what great teachers are able to do.
So one of the interesting criticisms of the Common Core, at least the final draft that came out, that may, I guess, speak to some of your concerns, is that it doesn't look like the Common Core really demands that anyone really read a piece of literature front to back. It's generally kind of short texts, usually informational texts, but there's no demand that you go from front page to the back page of a novel or something like that. So I'm wondering if you noticed that in the final draft and kind of your thoughts.
I do see this emphasis less on the whole and more breaking things up. One, that could be a concession to the fact that young people don't read long things anymore. If you ask my colleagues, they will tell you that it's getting harder and harder to assign a book, a novel, more than 200 pages long. People simply don't have the habit of doing a lot of reading at this point. So we got to go with shorter passages. That's one thing. Two, if we're focusing on reading skills, then we don't need long passages. Can you read this short passage? Look at the tests that we have. We have a passage this long, and then you answer 10, 12 questions, reading comprehension questions about it. So what we do is we reduce reading to a set of strategies, comprehension skills, the capacity to pick up, okay, what's the thesis here? What kind of evidence does the author use to support this thesis? What kind of irony might there be in the perspective? And those are all important things, but they are tailored, once again, to a performance, a very narrow, almost abstract performance, where you simply demonstrate that you understand a piece of prose, not that you get to bigger issues such as what is the significance of Hester Prynne walking out of that little jail cell wearing a dress, and she's got a bright red letter A that she has fashioned for herself with gold thread around it. What is the significance of her doing that?
Which now requires that you go really back through the whole book in your storehouse of knowledge about the book and reaction toward the book. And yeah, I wonder how much of that has to do with, like we were talking about earlier, the idea that you can have a great standard, but then the question becomes, well, how would you test that standard? And it seems like the Common Core is in an awkward spot because the research that I've done shows that the testing isn't necessarily mandatory. So a state could theoretically adopt the standards, but not necessarily adopt any testing regime that comes with the standards, which is odd because you wouldn't know if you progressed on the standards unless you tested them.
Right. Some states they said we're doing our own tests, and we'll see what happens. And I think that's partly pressure from parents. Mm-hmm. Parent groups saying we don't like the test. Here in New York City, where I am right now, 20% of kids last year opted out of the New York State tests.
Wow, that's a huge number.
It's a huge number, and it's spreading. The anti-Common Core is materializing more and more around tests.
Sure.
Rather than around the actual standards themselves. I mean, there are some criticisms of those and the way math is taught, but it's really the tests, because that's where parents feel we have real stakes, right? That's where my kids could suffer from Common Core because of the test. And so legislators, they wanted then to disengage Common Core from the test because they could save Common Core that way.
Yeah.
They could fend off too much political resistance to Common Core itself if they made some kind of accommodation with the tests.
Sure. So do you have an opinion on that? Do you think that was a smart play on the part of the Common Core state standards to detach the testing from the standards, making it possible to adapt the standards, but not any particular testing regime? Because what you now have is a lot of people opting out of the testing. Or do you think they should have maybe attached the two? Or do you not have an opinion on that?
I don't know enough to have an opinion about that. I mean, it might depend on state to state.
Yeah, well, I guess, and the reason I was asking is because we had mentioned, there's no questions on, there's no demand for the test to read the whole Scarlet Letter and answer a question like you had talked about. What's the significance of this thing at the end? And I guess when you bring up the testing, it occurs to me that maybe some state who comes up with their own testing will figure out a way to test something like that.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm wondering if we're reaching a point of exhaustion on a lot of these issues. The testing regime, people are getting so tired of the tests and all the different kinds of tests that there are these days. I was helping someone look for a job, and someone had to take a kind of personality test online with all these crazy questions. And I thought, oh my God, not another test. Everything is tested for these days. And I would hate to be going through that right now.
I think that's actually a really good spot to end it. I really appreciate this interview. It's very wide-ranging. So we've gone over several different areas that are really, really fascinating. Your participation in Common Core, kind of your stances on the best educational approaches and things. So I thank you, Dr. Bauerlein, for taking the time out to talk to us today.
Thank you, sir.